Hi everybody! Welcome to another Storytime with Sid, your local, I guess I've sort of turned into like Fae storyteller, so that's kind of exciting. I just wanted to say thank you so much for watching my last video if you did, and if you didn't, it's also fine. Hope you guys are holding up okay during this whole thing. I'm drinking, coffee right now. It's really good. It's good. I know that I winced, but I'm just getting used to it. I've never had coffee in my entire life, so we'll see how this goes. It's good. And do you like my mug? It's got a lot of really, really interesting human fairy tales in it, like Tales of Egypt. Well, I guess that was real. A History of America? I guess that's real too. But then there's also Faust. I think that's a story, unless that's true. Maybe one day I'll read that too. Alright, let's get into it. So, of course today I don't really know what I'm reading again, but I figure if we take a good look. Aw, that's cute. Wow, that's long. I don't know if I have time to read something that long today, but this looks interesting. It's called The Wild Swans. Now this might take place in the mortal realm because swans exist in both realms. They're very majestic, beautiful creatures, but I have a feeling that this one might take place in the mortal realm. Guess we're gonna find out. Okay. This is The Wild Swans. Far away from here where the swallows fly when we have winter, there lived a king who had 11 sons and one daughter, Eliza. The 7 brothers who were princes went to school wearing stars on their chest and swords at their side. They wrote on golden slates with diamond pencils and could recite just as well as memory as from book. You could hear at once that they were princes. Their sister, Eliza, sat on a little stool made of mirrors, holding a picture book that had cost half the kingdom. Oh, those children lived so well, but things wouldn't always be that way. Their father, who was king of all the land, married an evil queen who was not the least bit kind to the poor children. Even on the very first day they noticed it. Throughout the whole palace there were great festivities, and the children were playing tea party. But instead of giving them all the cakes and baked apples that could be found, the queen only gave them sand and a teacup, and told them to make believe it was something good. The following week, the queen sent little Eliza out to the country to some farm folks, and it wasn't long before she duped the king into thinking so badly of the poor princess that he no longer cared for them at all. "Fly off into the world and fend for yourselves," said the evil queen. "Fly like great birds without a voice." Yet she couldn't make it quite as bad as she intended, and they turned into 11 lovely wild swans, uttering a strange shriek as they flew over the castle windows over the park and forest. "Oh no, the princess turned into swans. That's so rude." It was still quite early in the morning when they came upon their sister Eliza, who was sleeping in the farmer's house. Here they hovered above the roof, twisting their long necks and beating their wings, but no one saw or heard them. They had to take off again, climbing high up towards the clouds, far away into the wide world. There they flew into a big, dark forest that stretched all the way down to the shore. Poor little Eliza stood in the farmer's house, playing with the green leaf. She had no other playthings. She stuck a hole in the leaf and peeked through it at the sun. That's bad for you. Don't look at the sun. She seemed to see the clear eyes of her brothers, and each time the warm rays of the sun shone on her cheek, she would think about all their kisses. Each day passed like the one before. When the wind blew through the big rose hedges outside the house, it would whisper, "Who could be more beautiful than you?" But the roses shook their heads and said, "Eliza is." And if the old woman sat in the doorway on Sunday reading her hymnal, the wind would turn the pages and say to the book, "Who could be more pious than you?" "Eliza is," said the hymnal. And that was the honest truth, what the roses in the hymnal had said. When she was 15, Eliza returned home. And when the queen saw how beautiful Eliza was, she grew angry and hateful. She would gladly have turned her into a wild swan like her brothers, but she didn't dare do so at once, since the king wanted to see his daughter. Early in the morning the queen went into the bathhouse, which was built of marble and adorned with soft cushions and the loveliest tapestries. She brought 3 toads, kissed them, and said to the first one, "Sit on Eliza's head when she gets into the bath, so she grows as sluggish as you are." To the second one she said, "Sit on her forehead, so she'll be as ugly as you are, and her father won't recognize her." To the third she whispered, "Rest on her heart, and give her an evil soul that will make her suffer." Then she put the toads in the clear water, which promptly turned into a greenish color. She called for Eliza, undressed her, and made her step into the water. As she ducked under, one of the toads sat in her hair, the second one on her forehead, and the third one on her breast. But Eliza didn't seem to notice at all. As soon as she stood up, 3 red poppies appeared floating in the water. As if the animals hadn't been poisonous and kissed by the witch, they would have been transformed into red roses, but the flowers became all the same, by resting on her head and her heart. She was too innocent and pious for the sorcery to have any power over her. When the evil queen saw this, she rubbed Eliza with walnut juice so she turned dark brown, smearing her beautiful face with a stinking salve and leaving her lovely hair all tangled. It was impossible to recognize Eliza. That's why when her father saw her, he was quite horrified that she was not his daughter. No one else would have recognized her either, except for the watchdog and swallows, but they were humble creatures and had nothing to say in the matter. So really, you made her tan, you ruined her hair, and what else? You made her smell. That sounds like every kid in the summer. And you don't recognize your daughter? I think this king needs to seek some help. Poor Eliza wept and thought about her 11 brothers who had all vanished. Sadly, she crept out of the castle and walked all day over field and marsh and into the great forest. She had no idea where she was going, but she felt so sad and longed for her brothers. No doubt they too had been chased out into the world. She would go looking for them and find them. Not long after she entered the forest, night fell. She had wandered from any road or path. Then she lay down on the soft moss and said an evening prayer, then leaned her head against a stump. It was quiet, the air was mild, and all around in the grass and on the moss, like a green fire, shimmered more than 100 glowworms. When she gently touched one of the branches with her hand, the glittering insects fell towards her like shooting stars. All night long she dreamed about her brothers. They were playing again as children, writing on the golden slates with diamond pencils and looking at the lovely picture book that cost half the kingdom. But on the slate they didn't draw just circles and lines that they had before, but rather the most daring deeds they had carried out, everything they had seen and experienced. And in the picture book everything was alive. The birds sang and people stepped out of the book and spoke to Eliza and her brothers. But when she turned the page they leaped back in so pictures wouldn't get out of order. When she awoke, the sun was already high overhead. She could actually see it because the tall trees had spread out their branches, thick and dense, but its rays played above her like a rippling golden veil. There was a fragrance of fresh nature, and the birds seemed to land on her shoulders. She heard water splashing. There were many large springs, all feeding into a pond with the loveliest sandy bottom. It's true that thick shrubbery grew all around, but in one spot the deer had dug a big opening, and this was where Eliza went down to the water. It was so clear that if the wind hadn't rustled the branches and shrubs making them move, she would have thought they were painted on the bottom. So sharply each leaf was reflected, both those that the sun shone through and those entirely in shadow. As soon as she saw her own face, she grew quite frightened. It was so horrid. But when she made her little hand wet and rubbed her eyes and forehead, she wiped away all of the makeup and the horrible salve that the queen put on her, and she recognized herself immediately. Then she took off all her clothes and stepped into the fresh water. A more lovely royal child could not be found in this world. When she had put her clothes back on and braided her long hair, she went over to the bubbling spring, drank from the hollow of her hand, and then wandered deeper into the forest without knowing where she was headed. She thought about her brothers, thought about the good Lord who surely would not abandon her. He had made the wild crab apples grow to feed the hungry. He showed her such a tree where the branches were weighed down by fruit. Here she ate her midday meal, and then propped up its branches. Then she entered the darkest part of the forest. It was so quiet that she could hear every little withered leaf that crumpled underfoot. Not a bird was in sight. Not a ray of sun could penetrate the huge, dense tree branches. The tall trunks stood so close together that when she looked straight ahead, it was like a grating of timber surrounding her. Oh, there was a loneliness she'd never known before. The night was so dark, not a single little glowworm gleamed from the moss. Sadly, she lay down to sleep. Then it seemed to her that the tree branches overhead moved aside, and our Lord looked up down on her with gentle eyes, and little angels peeked out over his head and under his arms. When she woke again in the morning, she didn't know whether she had dreamed it or whether it actually happened. She went on a few paces and came upon an old woman carrying a basket of berries. The old woman gave her some of them. Eliza asked whether she had seen 11 princes riding through the forest. "No," said the old woman, "but yesterday I saw 11 swans with gold crowns on their heads swimming along the stream nearby." And she led Eliza some distance away to a slope. Down below wound a stream. The trees on its bank stretched out their long leafy branches towards each other, and wherever they couldn't reach because of their natural growth, there they had pulled their roots loose from the earth and leaned out to the water to intertwine their branches. Eliza said farewell to the old woman and walked along the stream to the place where it flowed into the vast open seashore. The whole lovely ocean lay before the young girl, but not a sailing ship was in sight, not a boat could be seen. How was she going to journey any further? She looked at the countless pebbles along the shore. The water had worn them all smooth. Glass, iron, stone, everything that had washed up had been shaped by the water, and yet it was even softer than her delicate hand. "It keeps on rolling tirelessly, and then it smooths out whatever is hard. I will be just as tireless. Thank you for your wisdom, you clear rolling waves. My heart tells me that some day you will carry me to my dear brothers." Amid the washed-up seaweed lay 11 white swan feathers. She gathered them into a bouquet. Drops of water lay on them, but whether they were mist or tears it was impossible to tell. It was lonely at the seashore, but she didn't notice, because the sea offered endless variations, yes, more in a few hours than the inland lakes could display in a whole year. If a big black cloud passed by, it was as if the sea wanted to say, "I too can look dark." Then the wind would blow and the waves would turn white inside out, but when the clouds glowed crimson, the winds were asleep. The sea was like a rose petal. First it would turn green, then white, but no matter how calmly it rested, there was still gentle movement at the shore. The water rose faintly, like the breast of a sleeping child. When the sun was about to set, Eliza saw 11 wild swans with gold crowns on their heads come flying toward land. They glided one after the other like a long white ribbon. Then Eliza climbed up the slope and hid behind a shrub. The swans landed near her, flapping their great white wings. As soon as the sun sank down below the water, the swans shed their skins, and there stood 11 handsome princes, Eliza's brothers. She uttered a loud cry, because even though they had changed greatly, she knew it was them, felt sure it had to be them, and she flung herself into their arms, calling them by name. They were so happy when they saw and recognized their little sister, who was now so grown up and lovely. They laughed and they cried, and soon they understood how evil their stepmother had been to all of them. "We brothers," said the eldest, "fly like wild songs as long as the sun is in the sky. When it goes down, we assume our human form. That's why at sundown we must always have a place to rest our feet, because if we're flying up in the clouds, we would plunge, as humans do, into the deep. This is not where we live. There's a land just as beautiful as this one on the other side of the sea, but it's a long journey. We have to cross the vast ocean, and there is no island along the way where we might spend the night. Only a lonely little rock jutting up midway across. There's barely room for us to stand on it side by side. If the sea is rough, the water surges over us, and yet we thank our Lord for it. That's where we can spend the night in our human form. Otherwise we would never be able to visit our dear homeland, because we must spend 2 of the longest days of the year in our flight. Only once a year are we allowed to visit the land of our ancestors. We dare stay here only 11 days, flying over the great forest. We can glimpse the castle where we were born and where our father lives, and see the tall tower of the church where Mother is buried. Here we feel the trees and shrubs are our kin. Here our wild horses run across the plains the way we remember from our childhood. Here the charcoal burner sings, and the old songs we danced to as children. This is our homeland, to which we are drawn and where we found you, dear little sister. We dare stay here only 2 more days. Then we must fly over sea to the land that is lovely, though it is not our homeland. How can we take you with us? We have neither ship nor boat. How can I set you free? Said their sister. And they talked almost all night long, dozing only for a few hours. Eliza woke to the sound of swans' wings rushing overhead. Her brothers were once again transformed, and they flew in great circles and were finally far away. But one of them, the youngest, stayed behind. The swan lay his head in her lap, and she stroked his white wings. All day long they stayed together. Toward evening the others returned, and when the sun went down they stood there in their natural form. Tomorrow we must fly away from here, not daring to come back for another whole year. But we can't leave you like this. Do you have the courage to come along? My arm is strong enough to carry you through the forest. Shouldn't all of us then have strong enough wings to carry you across the sea? Yes, take me with you, said Eliza. They spent all night plaiting a net from the most supple willow bark and tough reeds, and it was big and strong. Eliza lay down on the net. When the sun came up, her and her brothers were changed into wild swans. They grabbed the net in their beaks and flew high up towards the clouds with their dear sister who was still asleep. Rays of sunlight fell across her face, and that's why one of the swans flew above her head so his broad wings could give her shade. They were far away from land when Eliza awoke. She thought she was dreaming because it seemed so wondrous to be carried over the sea high up in the air. At her side lay a branch with lovely ripe berries and a bunch of flavorful roots. Her youngest brother had gathered them and put them there for her. She smiled at him gratefully because she could tell that he was the one flying right above her head, shading her with his wings. They were so high up that the first ship they saw below looked like a white gull floating in the water. A great cloud loomed behind them. It was a whole mountain, and on it Eliza saw the shadow of herself and the 11 swans, looking so huge as they flew. It was a painting more magnificent than any she had ever seen. But as the sun rose higher and the cloud fell farther behind them, the hovering shadow picture vanished. All day they flew, like a racing arrow through the sky, yet they moved more slowly than usual now that they had their sister to carry. A bad storm was brewing. Evening was approaching. Anxiously, Eliza watched the sun sinking, and still there was no sign of that lonely rock in the sea. It seemed to her that the swans were flapping their wings harder. Oh, it was her fault that they couldn't make fast enough progress. When the sun went down, they would be turned into humans and plunge into the sea and drown. Then she prayed with all her heart to our Lord, but she still could see no rock. The black cloud was coming closer. The strong gusts of wind heralded a storm. The clouds formed one vast menacing wave that was shooting forward, solid as lead. One lightning bolt flashed after another. Now the sun had reached the rim of the sea. Eliza's heart was trembling. Suddenly the swans shot downward so swiftly that she thought they were falling, but then they were hovering again. The sun was halfway into the water when she first caught sight of the little rock below. It looked no bigger than a seal poking its head above the water. The sun was sinking quickly. Now it was no more than a star. Then her foot touched solid ground and the sun was extinguished, just like the last spark of a burning piece of paper. She saw her brothers arm in arm, grouped around her, but there was no room on the rock for anything else. The sea pounded against the rock and washed over them like a downpour. The sea glowed in an ever-blazing fire, and the thunder crashed, one peal after another. But the sister and her brothers held each other's hands and sang a hymn that gave them solace and courage. At daybreak the air was clear and calm. As soon as the sun rose, the swans flew off with Eliza, away from the island. The sea was still rough. When they were high in the air, it looked as if white crests of foam on the greenish-black swells were millions of swans floating on the water. When the sun rose higher, Eliza saw before them, half hovering in the air, a mountainous land with glittering masses of ice along the peaks, and in the midst stood a castle that was surely miles long, with one bold colonnade on top of another. Below swayed palm forests and magnificent flowers as big as mill wheels. She asked whether this was the country she was going to, but the swans shook their heads. What she saw was Fata Morgana's lovely, ever-changing cloud castle. They didn't dare bring humans inside. Eliza stared at it. Then the mountains, forest, and castle collapsed, and there stood 20 proud churches, all exactly alike, with tall towers and arched windows. She thought she could hear the sound of an organ. But it was the sea she heard. She was quite close to the churches when they turned into a entire fleet sailing beneath her. She looked down, but it was only sea fog racing across the water. Yes, things changed constantly before her eyes, and then she saw the real country she was heading for. Lovely blue mountains rose up with cedar forests, cities, and castles. Long before the sun went down, she was sitting on a mountain in front of an enormous cave covered with fine green vines that looked like embroidered tapestries. "Now we'll see what you dream here tonight," said the youngest brother, showing her to her bedchamber. "If only I could dream how I might set you free," she said. And this is the only thought that filled her whole mind. She prayed fervently to God for his help. Yes, even in her sleep she continued to pray. Then it seemed to her that she was flying high up in the air to Fata Morgana's cloud castle, and coming to greet her was the fairy, so beautiful and glimmering. Yet she looked very much like the old woman who had given her berries in the forest and told her about the swans with gold crowns. "Your brother can be freed," she said, "but you have to have the courage and endurance. The sea may well be softer than your delicate hands, and yet it reshapes the hard stones. But it doesn't feel the pain that your fingers will feel. It has no heart, nor does it suffer the fear and agony you must endure. Do you see these nettles that I am holding in my hand? Many like this grow around the cave where you're sleeping. Only those and the ones that grow on graves and churchyards can be used. Mark this well. These are the ones you must pick, even though they will burn blisters into your skin. Crush the nettles with your feet and you will have flax. That's what you will use to spin and knit 11 shirts of mail with long sleeves. Throw these shirts over the 11 wild swans, and the spell will be broken. But keep in mind that from the moment you begin this work up until it is finished, even if it takes years, you must not speak. The first word you say will stab like a deadly dagger in the hearts of your brothers. Their lives depend on your tongue. Mark this well." And in that instant she touched Eliza's hand to the nettles. It felt like a blazing fire and woke her up. It was broad daylight, and close to where she was sleeping lay some nettles like the ones she had seen in her dream. Then she fell to her knees, thanked our Lord, and went out of the cave to start her work. With her delicate hands she reached down to the hideous nettles. They were like fire. They burned big blisters into her skin and arms. But this she would gladly endure, for if she could free her dear brothers, she crushed each nettle with her bare feet and spun the green flax. When the sun went down, her brothers returned, and they were horrified to find Eliza so silent. They thought it was some new sorcery by their evil stepmother, but when they saw their hands, they realized what she was doing for their sake, and the youngest brother wept. Wherever his tears fell, there she felt no pain. The burning blisters vanished. At night she spent her task, for she would have no peace until she had freed her dear brothers. All the next day, while the wild swans were gone, she sat in solitude, but never had time flow by so quickly. One shirt of mail was already finished. Now she started on the next. Then a hunting horn rang out through the mountains. She grew quite frightened. The sound was coming closer. She heard the dogs barking. Terrified, she ran inside the cave, bound nettles that she had gathered and spun into a bundle, and sat down on top of it. At that moment, a huge hound came leaping from the thickets, right behind, and yet another. They were barking loudly, running back and forth. It was only a few minutes before all the hunters were standing in front of the cave, and the most handsome among them was the king of the land. He stepped over to Eliza. Never before had he seen such a beautiful girl. "How did you come here, you lovely child?" he said. Eliza shook her head. She didn't dare speak. It was a matter of her brothers' lives and salvation that she hid her hands under her apron so the king wouldn't see what she had to endure. "Come with me," he said. "You can't stay here. If you are as good as you are beautiful, then I will dress you in silk and velvet, and set a golden crown upon your head, and you shall live in my richest palace." And then he lifted her onto his horse. She wept, wringing her hands. But the king said, I wish only for your happiness. Some day you will thank me for this." And then he raced off through the mountains, holding her in front of him on his horse, and the hunters galloped behind. If he were really a good king, he would try and find out why she was crying before taking her. I'm just going to throw that out there for future reference. If someone's crying, don't steal them away from their home, even if it is in a cave. Food for thought. When the sun went down, the magnificent royal city with its churches and domes lay before them. The king led her into his palace, where great fountains splashed in the vast marble halls, where the walls and ceilings were resplendent with paintings. But she had no eye for any of that. She wept and grieved. Unresisting, she let women dress her in royal garments, weave pearls into her hair, and pull fine gloves over her burned fingers. When she stood there in all her splendor, she was so dazzlingly beautiful that the court bowed even lower to her, and the king chose her to be his bride, even though the archbishop shook his head and whispered that the beautiful forest girl was surely a witch. What is up with witches in these stories? She had dazzled their eyes and deceived the king's heart. But the king would not listen. He ordered music to be played, and the costliest dishes to be served, the loveliest girls to dance around her, and she was led through the fragrant gardens into the magnificent halls. But not a smile crossed her lips or entered her eyes. Sorrow filled them as her eternal inheritance and possession. Then the king opened a little chamber close to the room where she was to sleep. It was adorned with the costliest green tapestries and looked exactly like the cave where she had been living. On the floor lay the bundle of flax that she had spun from the nettles, and from the ceiling hung the shirt of mail that she had finished knitting. All of this one of the hunters had brought along, as kind of a curiosity. "Here you are. You can dream yourself back to your former home," said the king. "Here is what you were working on. Now in the midst of all your splendor, it may amuse you to think back on all those days." When Eliza saw everything that was so close to her heart, a smile played across her lips, and blood returned to her cheeks. She thought about her brother's salvation and kissed the king's hand. He pressed her to his heart and ordered all the church bells to proclaim the wedding celebration. The lovely mute girl from the forest was to be queen of the land. Then the archbishop whispered evil words to the king's ear, but they didn't reach his heart. The wedding took place, and the archbishop himself had to place the crown on her head. With evil intent, he pressed the tight circlet so firmly on her forehead that it hurt. But an even heavier band gripped her heart, her sorrow for her brothers. She didn't notice the bodily pain. Her lips were mute. A single word would take her brothers' lives, but in the end her eyes dwelled a deep love for the kind, handsome king who had done everything to make her happy. With each day she came to love him more with all her heart. Oh, if only she dared to confide in him and tell him of her torment. But mute she had to remain. In silence she had to complete her task. That's why at night she would slip from his side and go into the little alcove that was adorned like the cave. She finished knitting one shirt of mail after the other, but when she started on the 7th, she had no more flax. She knew that the nettles she needed grew in the churchyard, but she had to pick them herself. How was she going to get there? Oh, what is the pain in my fingers compared to the agony that my heart is suffering, she thought. I must attempt it. Our Lord will not abandon me. With fear in her heart, as if she were about to commit an evil deed, she crept into the moonlit night, down to the garden. She walked down the long lanes to the deserted streets and over to the churchyard. There she saw, sitting on one of the widest headstones, a group of lamias, hideous witches. They were taking off their rags as if they were going to bathe. Then they buried their long, gaunt fingers in the fresh graves, pulled out the bodies, and ate their flesh. Eliza had to pass close by, and they fixed their evil eyes on her. But she recited a prayer, gathered up the burning nettles, and carried them home to the palace. It has become apparent to me that my seeing orb became so disturbed by the fact that the archbishop was the only one that saw poor little Eliza relieve the nettles next to the witches, that it got scared and turned off. So this time I will say it kinder and not as sudden. Okay? That's a good idea. So, where are we? Only one person had seen her. The Archbishop. He was awake while the others slept. Now what he thought had been proven true. Things were not as they should be with the Queen. She was a witch, and she had deceived the king and all the people. In the confessional he told the king what he had seen and what he feared. As the harsh words fell from his tongue, the carved images of the saints shook their heads as if to say, "That's not true! Eliza's innocent!" But the Archbishop explained it differently, saying that they were bearing witness against her, that they were shaking their heads at her sin. Then 2 big tears rolled down the king's cheeks. He went home with doubt in his heart, and pretended to sleep at night, but no peaceful sleep came to his eyes. He noticed that Eliza got up, and every night she did the same. Each time he quietly followed her and saw her disappear into the alcove. Day by day his countenance grew darker. Eliza noticed but didn't know what it meant, yet it worried her, and what torment she suffered in her heart for her brothers. Over her royal purple and velvet robes ran her salty tears. They looked like glittering diamonds. Everyone who saw the rich splendor wished to be queen, yet soon she would be finished with her work. Only 1 shirt of mail remained, but she had no more flax and not a single nettle. So once again, one last time, she would have to go to the churchyard and pick several handfuls. She thought with fear about the lonely walk and the terrifying lamias, but her will was strong, and so was her faith in our Lord. Eliza went out, but the king and the archbishop followed. They saw her disappear through the wrought iron gate through the churchyard. When they approached, the lamias were sitting on a headstone, just as Eliza had seen them. The king turned away. From among them he imagined one whose head rested on her breast that very evening. Oh no, he thinks that Eliza turned into a witch. The people must judge her, he said, and the people decided that she should be burned in the red flames. That escalated so quickly. From the splendid royal halls she was led to a dark, dank dungeon, where the wind whistled through the grated window. Instead of velvet and silk, they gave her a bundle of nettles that she had gathered, and that's what she could lay her head on. The hard, burning shirts of mail that she had knit would be her comforter and coverlet, but they could give her nothing more precious. Once again she set about her work and prayed to God. Outside the street urchins sang spiteful songs about her. Not a soul comforted her with a loving word. Then, toward the evening, there was a rushing sound close to the grating, a swan's wing. It was the youngest of her brothers. He had found his sister, and she sobbed aloud with joy, even though she knew that this coming night might be her last. But now her work was almost finished, and her brothers had come. The archbishop arrived to spend the last hour with her. He had promised the king to do so, but she shook her head, begging him with her eyes and demeanor to leave. On this night she had to finish her work, otherwise it would all be for naught. Everything. The pain, the tears, the sleepless nights. The archbishop went away, speaking evil words against her. But poor Eliza knew she was innocent and went on with her work. Tiny mice ran across the floor, dragging the nettles over to her feet, trying to help a little. A thrush sat next to the window, grating, and sang all night long, as merrily as it could so that she wouldn't lose her courage. It was just barely daybreak. Not an hour later would the sun come up, when the 11 brothers stood at the palace gate, demanded to be taken before the king. But they were told this was impossible. It was still night after all. The king was asleep and no one dared wake him. They begged. They threatened. The guards came. Yes, even the king stepped outside and asked what the meaning of this was. Then suddenly the sun came out, and there were no brothers to be seen, but over the palace flew 11 swans. Out of the city gates streamed the entire populace. They wanted to see the witch burn. A wretched horse pulled the cart in which she sat. They had given her a smock to wear, made of rush sackcloth. Her lovely hair hung loose around her beautiful face. Her cheeks were deathly pale. Her lips were moving faintly, but her fingers were twisting the green flax. Even on the way to her death, she never stopped working as she begun. The 10 shirts of mail lay at her feet. The 11th she was knitting. The mob jeered at her. "Look at the witch! See how she's muttering! She doesn't have a hymnal in her hand!" No, she's sitting there with her odious sorcery. Take it away from her and tear it to 1,000 pieces. They all surged toward her, wanting to tear it to bits. Then 11 swans came flying. They alighted around her, the cart beating their wings, and the crowd drew back in horror. It's a sign from heaven. She must be innocent, many whispered. But they didn't dare say it aloud. Then the executioner grabbed her by the hand. In haste she threw 11 shirts over the swans, and there stood 11 handsome princes, but the youngest had swan's wing in place of an arm, because his shirt of mail was missing a sleeve. She hadn't managed to finish it. Now I dare to speak, she said. I am innocent. And when the people saw what had happened, they bowed to her as a saint. But she sank lifeless into her brother's arms. So deeply had the anguish, fear, and pain affected her. Yes, she is innocent, said the eldest brother, and then he explained everything that had happened. As he spoke, the scent of millions of roses began to spread, for every piece of wood in the fire had grown roots and shot out branches. There stood a fragrant hedge so tall and huge, with enormous red roses. At the very top sat one blossom, white and gleaming, that shone like a star. The king broke it off and placed it on Eliza's breast. Then she awoke, with peace and happiness in her heart. All the church bells began to ring of their own accords. Birds appear in great flocks, and back towards the palace had a wedding procession like no king had ever seen before. And that was the Wild Swans. It's a very interesting story. I think that probably happened in the realm of man, though I don't know why it wouldn't be any history books. Probably because humans have an aversion to magic. But now you know. I quite liked that one. Think of someone that is so dedicated to their love of their family that they would go through anything to make sure they were well again. I know there's plenty of people out there doing that now. Plenty of people out there that are working hard and putting themselves through sleepless nights and thankless days to make people happy, healthy, and well again. And for that, we thank them. Alright, I'm going to get back into this coffee, which is now cold, and I hope every one of you has a wonderful and lovely day.